I see patients who have not had access to dental care. And so their understanding of what we're doing or what should be happening is usually pretty limited. I had one a couple weeks ago, a patient who was, I think, in his 60s and said he hadn't been into the dentist since he was about 10 years old.
Wow.
And literally started crying. It was like, nobody has ever explained things like that to me. He's going to totally change his perspective on the healthcare system because somebody actually took the time to sit down and talk to him about it. We have to meet you where you're at for you to be able to get this care.
Alyssa Aberle is a fierce advocate for providing dental care to underserved communities. Partnering with Kids in Need of Dentistry, Salud Family Health Centers, Stride Community Health Center, and other nonprofits to help people receive the care they need to stay healthy. She's a practicing clinician with over 13 years of experience. She was the previous executive director for the Colorado Dental Hygienists Association, and she's a licensed ADS infection control trainer. Alyssa has profound insights when it comes to navigating the limited resources most offices face when it comes to implementing infection control practices. And she'll share how you can be successful when it comes to compliance.
It eventually affects the bottom line because that means you have to buy some extra things and you have to do some extra things, but it's the right thing to do and it's going to protect our patients.
Alyssa, for those who don't know you, tell me a little bit about why you're so passionate about serving underserved communities and even how you got into like that whole nonprofit CHC space.
Sure. It's a good question because I've known since I graduated hygiene school that was where I wanted to be. And I think it started, I had done some mission trips when I was in high school and like first couple of years of college to Latin America. Ironically, I learned French in high school thinking I wanted to do mission trips to West Africa and then went to Latin America and didn't know any Spanish.
Wow.
So had to learn that after high school. But I went on a few mission trips and just really loved going to where people were and helping them where they're at instead of them having to do it for themselves, come somewhere to get that help. So just really loved the people in Latin America too, and the language and the culture. And when I came back to the United States, got really plugged in with a group of students on my campus that was the Spanish speaking. They were all had moved to the United States for college and just loved, again, the culture and the language and working with them, and found out that there were clinics where you can treat a lot of patients who come from other countries or speak Spanish. So I could use some of the language skills I was then learning after learning French. So just really fell in love with that. And then kind of saw a bigger picture as I went through hygiene school of the fact that there were communities that were just underserved, weren't getting the same access to care, weren't getting the same resources, had language barriers, had cultural barriers. And so just fell in love with trying to help meet that need, and found nonprofits and federally qualified health centers and some other organizations that were doing that work in these communities. So just stayed there forever.
Yeah, that is so cool. I think, can you help bridge the gap for me and what is uniquely different about these type of spaces, the nonprofits, the CHCs, other than the private practice space, outside of obviously one's for-profit, one's nonprofit, but what are some of the other differences you notice in working in these different spaces that's really unique to the nonprofit CHC world?
Yeah. So, when we're talking about serving certain communities, underserved populations, they really try to address the barriers that exist. So they're looking at patients not just as putting an ad in a newspaper and having a new patient come in. They're where are the people who haven't traditionally been seen in a dental office or in a medical office, and what are the barriers that they're experiencing? Is it language? Is it childcare? Is it transportation? Is it, a variety of different things? And then how can we address that? So one of the FQHCs that I worked for was specifically in communities that had a high migrant farm worker population, because they were noticing that those people were coming here only for a season and they weren't getting healthcare services while they were here. So they had intentionally set up clinics in areas that had migrant farm workers. So they're really looking at more of the whole picture of where are these people? Why are they not able to access the same services? And how can we kind of solve some of those problems? And then I think the other difference is size of organization and breadth of services. So a lot of the FQHCs are big organizations with multiple locations versus a private practice with 5 to 10 employees.
Yeah.
And they're usually providing dental, medical, behavioral health, wraparound services. So they're looking at not just dental services, they're looking broader.
Yeah. How have you seen that impact the patient experience? Because it's not just one specific service. It's like they are looking at the person holistically. And how does that impact the way that you build trust with them and interact with them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the trust thing is huge because the patients get to know that facility. They get to know how that organization works. A lot of times if language and culture are barriers to people getting into care, once they've gotten through some of those barriers and gotten into one place, they want to stay there. Yeah. They don't want to try to do that multiple times for every different service they need. So if you can keep everything housed together, they already know you and trust you and have become familiar with how to make appointments and how to access the language services and how to do different things. So they really like everything being together. Yeah. And then, of course, if transportation is an issue, they know how to get there. They're usually, FQHCs try to put themselves along bus routes and along like main roads so that people can get to them easier too.
I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
But that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. What are some of the, in nonprofit space, typically, and so correct me if I'm wrong, there's constraints to resources. How have you navigated and overcome some of those in that nonprofit spaase? Yeah,
it's really interesting because you're looking at like reimbursement and funding differently when you're working for a nonprofit or a federally qualified health center. I mean, you still have to stay afloat. You still have to be sustainable. It's just not everything is coming from patient fees. So there are sometimes grant opportunities that can help support different programs. The way that FQHCs get reimbursed by insurance is a little different than private practice. Sometimes you get an encounter rate versus fee-for-service rate. So it's a little different, but a lot of it is driven based off of how many encounters you can do. So how many patients are you seeing? How many patients are getting access to services? So it's more of a numbers game on getting people access versus how many procedures can you do or what dollar procedures can you do in a visit. So a lot of that funding comes more through an access lens than a like fee-for-service lens. So you're still working within those constraints. It's just you're juggling a different ball than in private practice.
Is there similar challenges specifically with infection control? Because my understanding, specifically with community health clinics, is they actually get funding for specifically outlined for infection control, which is a little unique, right? If you're working for a for-profit private practice, you have to be the one to allocate that. But I don't actually know how that works with just other nonprofits.
Yeah.
Help me understand that space.
It's interesting because with the FQHCs, again, because you have medical and behavioral health and other services, the funding sources are a little different. And sometimes they are earmarked for something like infection control or PPE. During the pandemic, we seemed to have access to stuff that private practices didn't. And I don't know if that was through like federal networks of other FQHCs or through purchasing agreements because we were larger organizations, but we didn't seem to have some of the same constraints that I was hearing from private practice folks. But then like nonprofit dental organizations, it's a little different because they tend to operate a little more like a private practice, that they're smaller, gotta find those resources where you can. But again, you can have donations and grants and things like that sometimes that can help offset stuff, especially if you're doing a specific program with a specific population. You can sometimes qualify for grants that would help you offset some of those costs. So again, it doesn't all have to be patient fees. You can have some alternative funding. Nobody's probably going to the private practice dentist in Centennial and just offering to pay for their PPE. So, those aren't always available to private practices.
Well, it sounds like there's a similar through line with for-practice and nonprofit in terms of allocating resources. There still has to be, if I'm understanding correctly, an intentional decision to say this is important. We need to find a way to resource this.
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think it always has to be the priority. Like somebody has to say, yes, we have this pile of money, but this is what it's going to go to, and this is what we are going to have to sacrifice, and you always have to make those decisions. I think when you're part of a larger organization, especially one that gets federal funding of any kind, you prioritize some of those compliance things a little bit more, just because it's not just the fear of the dental board coming in. Right. You're looking at broader compliance issues, accreditation with JCO or AAAHC or other accrediting agencies. You have, grant proposals or photos that are published places. So you want to make sure things like look a certain way, don't get caught not following compliance. So I think there's just other considerations why that becomes more of a priority.
Yeah, that is wild. You've been a clinician for over 15 years. And correct me if I'm wrong, when you started, you started in this space.
Yep.
So you've been in the nonprofit CHC world for over 15 years. I've
briefly in private practice, but I've never worked permanently for a private practice.
You've gone back to what you know you love, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Out of all of your years in that space, what's a story that's just been ingrained in just your experience? It was powerful. It was positive. It was like a really meaningful story for you that you hold on to as a reason to keep continuing to serve the way that you serve?
I mean, there's so many, because I've done pediatric. I ran a school-based program for about 8 years. Yeah. I currently work with adults who are in temporary housing facilities. And so I see patients who have not had access to dental care. And so their understanding of what we're doing or what should be happening is usually pretty limited. And the organization I work with right now, Deserving Dental, one of the things I think is really cool about kind of our system and our model is that we sit down with every patient after we've taken radiographs, and we walk them through it, literally step by step of, okay, when I'm looking at your x-rays, this is what I'm looking at. Here's where everything would be. This is what a healthy tooth looks like. This is what a not healthy tooth looks like. And I think when you have, I had one a couple weeks ago, a patient who was, I think, in his 60s and said he hadn't been into the dentist since he was about 10 years old and literally started crying. It was like nobody has ever explained things like that to me. And just he's going to totally change his perspective on the healthcare system because somebody actually took the time to sit down and talk to him about it. Or when I have a patient who has had a really bad experience with a dental office or provider, they've had trauma as a kid maybe related to dental pain. They've had a bad experience where an office to them felt like they were just pushing them through and treating them like the dollar sign is what I hear a lot. And then you just kind of slow down and explain things to them and answer all their questions and let them take it at their own pace. And you just see them processing as things are happening. That this isn't normal and that there are people that will take that time. And so because a lot of the nonprofits and FQHCs do operate a little differently as far as sustainability and financial situations, you can sometimes take things at a different pace because it's not just the dollar value of that hour. It's that patient getting access and that patient coming back and getting their care and, them wanting to bring their family in for care because you're looking at more of an access lens. So just the fact that you can kind of slow it down and be like, if we don't get through this whole procedure, that's okay.
Right.
Nobody's upset if we didn't get through a cleaning because we have to meet you where you're at for you to be able to get this care. So I think those are the reasons I just
that's so powerful.
Stay with it.
Well, it's interesting to me too, because in the for-profit space, I guess the assumption would be the more patients you see, the more revenue you bring in. But it's almost, to me, it's like if you can treat someone with such love and care,
mm-hmm.
they'll not only want to come back because they felt that.
Right.
They'll bring their whole family because they felt that.
Yeah.
And you're experiencing that, which I think is so powerful.
I always think of like the movie Miracle on 34th Street where the Santa like sends them to the other department store to get something that they didn't have. But then they actually earn more customers because that person's like, well, I'm going to come back here for everything. And it's that same mindset of if patients feel like they're valued and heard and, you know, you see them as a person, they're going to stay there and be more loyal than if they feel like they were just rushed through. And again, that's not just nonprofits. I see that in private practices too. But I think it's just a shifting. I know we're all stressed about finances and rent is up and labor costs are up and everything. But if we can kind of step back and be like, this is why we're here, is to provide this patient the best experience they can have.
Yeah. I think that's so powerful. When I'll talk about the tension, the feeling, the tension of resources and the costs are going up and all that stuff is happening. Why would a private practice or a nonprofit look to allocate and sometimes significant amount of resources to infection control? I mean, obviously the flip side, and I'll be super black and white. The flip side is like, you know, I'm just going to take the risk, whatever. The other side's crazy buttoned up, right? You're doing everything by the books. And I feel like most people kind of float in the middle. And so we take people where they're at, but it's like, I only have a limited amount of resources. My team's super taxed. There's a lot going on. Now I got to wear this waterline thing now that I need to be doing. Why is that so important to wrestle with and move forward in?
I think it all comes back to like when we were in school, when we graduated from dental school, hygiene school, assisting school, whatever program you were in, we all took an oath to treat patients a certain way, not cause any harm to them, always be constant learners, always want to do the best. And so I think it's that internal, like, I'm going to do it because it's the right thing. Like, I know that it's the right thing to do. It's providing the safest care to the patient. It's me doing everything I can not to cause harm to that patient. And infection control is kind of like the underlying thing of, it's not like a root canal that goes bad and the patient comes back in pain immediately. You're just putting people at the potential risk of catching some potentially bad diseases. And so they may not necessarily immediately know it was because of the dental visit, like they would a root canal, but you're still putting them in harm's way. You're still putting that potential risk for them. And so I think it's just that hopefully ethical like value in all of us. And then you see it also cause tension between team members because some people value it and some people don't. And some people are like, no, we're just going to do it the easiest, fastest, cheapest way. While others are like, no, this is the right thing to do. And even if it costs a little bit more, it's the right thing to do. And then you see people leave their jobs to go find other jobs because they can't work in that environment for either side. And so I think when we're looking at our current resource constraints, workforce issues, I mean, the people who are keeping employees are doing something right. And so in a lot of those cases, I knew I had PPE during the pandemic. I knew that they were testing their water lines. I knew that they would provide the stuff that we needed to sterilize our instruments safely. So you know that you have that security, you're going to stay with that practice. And so it would solve some of those issues, I think, if everyone had that same standard.
Well, let's dive into that because you're totally right in that, you know, something that we deal with oftentimes is they hear about waterline maintenance and then they take that to their team and there's a difference of values, which is really challenging. How would you advise they navigate that?
I mean, I think ultimately, if everyone doesn't have the same core values, you're not going to be aligned on a lot of things. So the practices, again, that I've seen be really successful are really clear about what those values are. Like when you get hired, they're like, hey, if you want to come work here, here are our values. We're always going to do the above and beyond the standard of care. We are always going to provide these types of services to our patients. Like, if you can identify those core values and everyone on the team is totally bought into them, those aren't even issues. Like, no one's going to question you on waterline, because they're going to be like, yeah, you know more, you do better. So now we know we should be doing this. We're going to do this because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Where you don't have those tensions of like trying to force people into feeling the same values you do. Because, I don't know, to some extent, you can't really change other people's values. So if you're just not aligned from day one, I could yell at you about water lines all day.
It's not gonna matter.
If the rest of the team isn't on board, they're probably never going to be. So, and you're like, well, maybe they'll get caught someday and then they'll take it seriously. And I'm like, well, I don't want to work for a place that only took it seriously because they got caught or disciplined. So I think it always comes back to finding that place that you would send your family to. You could go home at night and know that you all as a team provided that level of care.
Yeah. I think you hit on something so huge to just team culture. And I think you typically, I'm going to overgeneralize for sure, in that nonprofits typically have this figured out and for-profits can learn in this instance, where it's like nonprofits are crazy missional. And so the team is always like serving the mission, but that's so unifying. And to your point with like the core values, like that feeds into mission. And so people feel like they're coming on board for something bigger than themselves. And for-profits, sometimes that gets missed. Speak to a little bit with the nonprofits. I'm sure you felt that really powerfully. Like, there's such a defined mission and core value driven culture. And I would imagine, one, the people that come into that are different. And then the team is different because of that.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen both. I've seen both ways. But I think one of the things that I noticed in like FQHC specifically was that the dentists, the hygienists, the assistants, the office managers, all these different people who are working in your office are all employees of this organization. Nobody's the owner. And so when you're talking about adding water lines in, you're talking about, increasing barriers or whatever you're doing infection control related, it's not coming out of any of your pockets ultimately, because you're all getting paid a salary. Whereas in a private practice dental office, like somebody's salary is affected by adding expenses. So there's always that tension. But I think, like you said, when you work for an organization that has a mission and a vision and has those values on their website usually, you know what you're getting into. Like you're going there for a reason. And so usually that helps kind of drive that culture where, again, private practices can do that. That's just not always top of their mind. And I've seen practices who do it really well, and it shows. And you can tell that that's happening. But yeah, it's something that you have to be intentional about. And then even with an FQHC, like we had so many locations that the culture here could be different than the culture there, or the culture between in the medical team could be different than the culture in the dental team. Even though the organization has the same mission, vision, values, each team kind of operates differently. And I talk a lot to teams about that when I'm doing infection control training, because I'm like, a patient can sense that. Like they come in and they see you do something, but then they see a different provider the next time and they're wearing different PPE. They didn't put barriers on something that you did. They notice a different way that you handled your sterilized instruments. They do notice those differences. And so they start to pick up on those. So if it's not something that is really a culture that everyone is invested in and everyone's consistent with, it starts to be apparent to even the patients. And I think especially since the pandemic, patients are really aware of what's happening. They're watching when you wash your hands. They're watching your PPE. And so even in a private practice dental office, if the dentist doesn't wear a lab coat, but the hygienists all do, or this person opens the instruments in front of the patient, this person already has them laying out on the tray when you get in there, they start to notice those inconsistencies. Now, are they going to notice if you're testing your water lines? Probably not.
Right.
But again, that comes back to of like, if that culture is there and everyone's consistent, then they can hopefully know that some of those behind the scenes things are happening. But if the things up front aren't happening that they can see, they're going to question everything else.
Totally. Yeah. With infection control specifically, how can you be really good at it? We often talk about the idea of like an infection control coordinator and like actually giving ownership of that and elevating somebody into that space.
Yeah.
But there's so many different facets and so many different things to be doing. And oftentimes offices are already feeling overwhelmed. How have you seen that handled really well?
So in the FQHCs, one of the things I thought was really unique, and I actually took on this role, but they created a role, like it was on my job description that I was the infection control coordinator. They listed out what duties that included, and they gave me some admin time to do those things. So I think that's huge, and I think that's something that gets lost in a lot of organizations, big or small, is that you're trying to do these things in between patients, or at the beginning of your day or at the end of your day, and you're like, I already don't have time to eat, much less do all these other things. And so when I've seen it be successful is when there's time set aside for it. Just like anything, if you're going to get good at playing basketball, you practice and you have time set aside in your schedule that you're doing that every day. It's the same thing. You have to set aside that time, because if it's just going to happen whenever people have free time, it's never going to happen. So I think, again, it's hard because we're so production mindset focused that, if this person isn't treating patients in that time, then they're not producing for the practice. But they are. They're supporting the rest of you doing the production that you're doing. So I always encourage the teams, set aside some time, especially when you're first putting systems in place. It's pretty time intensive.
Oh, for sure.
Once things are moving along, then maybe it could be, 4 hours a week, and then eventually maybe 4 hours a month. And then maybe, it can get spaced out. But when you're first setting up these systems and figuring it out and researching products and trying to figure out what should happen and creating manuals and operating procedures, like that stuff takes time.
It's a lot.
Yeah. But then you're like, okay, we're using the same products. So you get in a groove, and then it's like maybe a few hours a week, so that you can make sure all the logs were done, make sure all the maintenance was done. You can make sure everybody checked off different things, because ultimately what's going to be sustainable is systems, but systems have to be built. So it's just, again, taking that time, setting it aside. Sometimes people need extra education and resources. So like the CDIPC certification that ADS and the DUWL Foundation did, that's a great opportunity for somebody on your team if they don't feel qualified to be in that role. Because that's the other thing I see is that people are like voluntold that this is now your job. You're now the infection control coordinator, and you're like, I don't know what that means. So, giving them some extra education, sending them to the ADS conference or sending them to different CE courses where they can really start to understand what that looks like, so that they feel equipped to do their job, because otherwise they're going to feel even more overwhelmed. It's going to take a lot more time because they're trying to figure out what to do. So I think just supporting that person in that role, giving them time and resources.
Oh my goodness, there's so many good things here. Okay, so we like to say, you got to spend time working on the business, not just in the business. And you just hit the nail on the head with that. Like, you got to be able to step back and be able to build the systems and processes that do take a lot of time, a significant amount of time. Let's dive in, because community and feeling like you're not doing this alone, I feel like is such a powerful force to build the momentum and doing the right thing. It's so easy to be disheartened. I mean, goodness, how many times do we hop on a call with someone that's doing this by themselves and they failed their waterline test? It crushes them. They don't know that happens all the time, and people are trying to remediate that. But it's like, if you're isolated, let alone from an educational gap, but just like, you just don't know what you don't know, and you're trying to figure this out. How have you seen people stepping into this role and doing it alongside others be so beneficial? What are some practical next steps? Maybe someone that's getting voluntold to do these things. How can they bring that into a community to help them do this really well?
I mean, I always think CE courses are a good like starting ground because you're going to be in the course with other people who are also interested in this. So it's a little bit of an echo chamber because you're not talking to like the people you have to convince later, but you're talking to people who also care about this. But you start to see some like similar names and faces. Going to conferences specifically that are infection control related will help start to build that community. I think Facebook is really actually helpful. I know it has its downsides, but there's a lot of good Facebook groups out there. And I think sometimes people will connect in a Facebook group because they'll ask a question about, are we really supposed to be doing this? How are you guys doing this? And then people can chime in, and then they start kind of separately like DMing each other, asking each other questions. And so I know when I was doing the infection control coordinator role for one of the FQHCs, I was like on my own island. Like, yes, they had set aside time for it. Yes, I was doing my CDIPC certification, but I didn't know other infection control coordinators at other health centers. So here I am. I've got all this paperwork and binders and stuff. And I'm like, okay, I guess I'll just figure this out. But if you can talk to other people who have already done it or are also starting to do it and bounce ideas, like, don't reinvent the wheel. There's somebody out there who's already developed systems. Sometimes manufacturers, companies like ProEdge have some of these resources already started for you. So again, you're not reinventing the wheel. Our friend Michelle Strange, she has an infection control coordinator guidebook that will walk you through some stuff. So there are resources out there, but again, it's like, how do you find them when you're first starting? So I think connecting with other people who are in the same boat is really helpful.
Yeah. I think, initially when you get voluntold to do that, you're right. There's so many directions you could go. There's so many things you need to dive into. It's like a real great, clear focus is find someone that can help, that has either done it before or someone that will do it with you, because you're absolutely right. It's like, we've built the protocols for you to implement. You can talk to the people that have been doing this for 5, 10, 15 years and have done it. And that's just like so much more helpful. And it probably puts a ton of the anxiety and worry off your plate because, gosh, knowing that someone else has been successful in doing that thing is so huge. Taking a bigger step back, how can the industry as a whole value safety and infection control practices to a higher regard? What does that even look like?
That's a good question. Again, I think the pandemic shifted some things in that space because for a long time, so a lot of this conversation around infection control and dentistry started with HIV in the 80s. And now, like, these generations are like, what was the big deal? Like, you guys were all panicked about it, but we've just grown up with it. It's not as panic mode as you once thought it was. And so people get into this kind of complacent mode where these aren't really big risks. These are just things that people want to scare us with, But then you have something that comes about like the pandemic and people start paying attention to it more and start trying to learn more. And there's still a lot of confusion and misinformation that happens in that. But even the public was asking questions and wanted to know more. We wanted to know more. We were trying to figure out the best way to do things. And so I think it's just knowing that there are always those potential risks out there. And again, even if you can't see them, even if somebody's not coming in tomorrow with hepatitis B, hopefully not, from a dental visit, you know that you did everything you can to protect them from contracting something and protecting your team members from these potential infections too, so that people can just, come to the dentist and not have those fears. But you see a lot of patients, and again, I think it's increased, but it always was a little bit like this, and they're very leery of the dental office as a whole, but they're like, that thing that you just touched, was that clean, or did you have that out for the last patient?
Yeah.
Well, are you putting on gloves for that? Well, where is your stereo? Like, they're starting to ask questions, which I think is good.
Yeah, totally.
But you should hopefully know the answers to where those things are coming from. And so I think it's just, I mean, it all comes back to that values and just doing the right thing and doing everything you can to provide that safest visit. I don't really know how you can change the whole industry, because I think there's still a little bit of that. Unless I get in trouble, I don't care.
Yeah, totally.
But I think there are a lot of us who, if we think back, we remember why we got into healthcare in the first place. It was to help patients, to provide them good care, to keep that high quality. We're all very concerned about our profession and wanting to maintain those standards, but that goes for how we treat our patients too. So I think at the end of the day, we all have that in us. It's just we got to remember that that's why we got into it, and that's what should be important. And I know it eventually affects the bottom line, because that means you have to buy some extra things and you have to do some extra things, but it's the right thing to do, and it's going to protect our patients.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about how really, like, the private practice space, what can they learn from how nonprofits operate?
I mean, I think ultimately it's just that, again, you're not really production focused, you're access focused or mission focused. So the nonprofit that I work for, we are hygiene only. We don't have any dentists that work for us, but we are mobile. And so we go into different facilities every day. And we are primarily in long-term care facilities and temporary housing facilities. So we're working with patients who haven't had dental visits in a long time.
Yeah.
And I think we know that because of where we are and the type of facilities that we're at. I think private practices probably have a lot of those patients too. They just don't always know it. It's not as outwardly obvious. Yeah. And so we know that a lot of our patients are coming in without having seen a dental provider in 20 plus years. They maybe have had some trauma in their life. They've maybe had domestic violence in their life. Who knows their situation. So I had a patient this week who, at a facility that I knew was a domestic violence survivors facility. So I knew that those patients had that trauma in their past, where a private practice would not necessarily know that about this patient.
Yeah.
But because of that, she was really open with me about where she was at and what she needed and how she was feeling. So we have 90 minutes per patient. We see 5 patients a day. And she had a really hard time leaning back in the dental chair because it's a very vulnerable position. You're kind of at somebody's mercy.
Totally.
You can't get up. You can't run away. And people are in your mouth, which if you've had any kind of abuse in your history, that can be really triggering. And so she would let me start the procedure. I would talk her through everything. I used to run a school-based program, so I'm used to the show, tell, do. And that's kind of where I started with her. Of, this is what we're going to do. This is what the water is like. This is what the suction's like. And just really walked her through. And then every few minutes, she would just kind of wave her hand at me, and she'd be like, I got to sit up. And so we would sit her up. She would get some water, have to kind of calm down. And then she'd be like, okay, I think I'm ready. And we would lean back. And so I knew going into it that we were not going to, have any major procedure done that day. It was really an introductory visit, but I'm building that trust and building that comfort for her so that maybe she'll come back and get more work done later. But again, it's at her pace because it's not like I'm like, well, I only have 20 minutes and then I got to go because somebody's waiting on me.
Right.
Because we're in a facility where I don't have 6 operatories and I'm not waiting on somebody else to come check my patient. I can go at the pace I need to go.
Yeah. So,
I mean, private practices do the same thing and can do the same thing, but I think you don't always know where somebody's at. And we just assume, I've had patients who don't know how a suction works. They don't know how the saliva ejector works. They don't know how any of that works because they've never been to a dentist. And we just assume everybody knows how this works, and they don't. So sometimes in a private practice, you don't always know all of that background with a patient, whereas because of the places where I am, I get some of that information. So just taking it slow, meeting the patient where they're at, being okay if the production number doesn't show as much value as what was actually provided during that visit, because it's hard because they don't always match up. But
well, and everybody's coming in with their own stuff, and to be able to slow down and recognize that. You said the show, tell, do, which I think is such a great way to build trust, and something that every office can do. It's like, rather than, hey, you have 3 cavities or this needs to be done, let me invite you into what I'm seeing and show you the x-rays or show you this, like,
I think a lot of offices that I know of are starting to use intraoral photos for that, of like, if I take a picture of this tooth, even if I'm not necessarily showing the patient, I'm showing the dentist or the other hygienist or whomever, the patient gets to see it up on the big screen and they start to like, oh, that's what that looks like. But we really intentionally build that into our appointment time. So when we have a new patient, we take their x-rays and then we actually, like, I sit down at the computer, I scooch them up to the computer, and I'm like, has anyone ever showed you your x-rays? And they're like, no, nobody's ever shown me my x-rays. And I'm like, okay, well, this is the bite stick. And this is, you know, what you're looking at is a healthy tooth. And if you see white, this is what it means. And if you see dark, this is what it means. And they start pointing at it. They're like, oh, there's a cavity and there's a cavity. And what's going on with this tooth? And what is this white line through the end of my tooth? I'm like, okay, that's a root canal. Good question. You know, we can start talking about it. And so then by the time I get to the dental chair, they're like bought in. Like, they know what's going on. They're ready. We've talked about bone loss and what it looks like. So when I'm doing my periodontal charting and I'm saying numbers out loud, I get to a 4 or 5, they're like, "Ooh, that's not good." And so like they really know, are like bought into it. So it's cool to get to watch them like have that aha moment.
So cool.
A lot of patients also tell me that nobody has actually ever showed them how to brush their teeth.
Interesting. Wow.
Like, you start showing them how to brush their teeth and they're like, this is something that everyone just assumes you've been taught at some point in your life. You're handed a toothbrush and say, brush twice a day. They don't know how to do that properly. And so it's really interesting, just, again, figuring out where patients are and what they do and don't understand. Don't, you know, patronize or tell them something that maybe they do know, but a lot of times they don't. And they'll be like, actually, no, nobody's ever talked to me about that. So they're willing to have that conversation. So it's cool.
Do you think the next generation of clinicians are seeing, like, how are they seeing dentistry different from the current generation or even the previous generation? Is there more focus on that type of connection and relationship? Is there a deeper focus on infection control? It just feels like the next generation, just globally, is so focused on authenticity and wanting to have that in every interaction. I'm just curious how that plays into dentistry. Yeah,
it's interesting because I think they get pegged as like the social media generations, right? That are just on TikTok all the time doing dances. But I actually spoke to a high school class recently at a charter school here in Denver, and they're a project-based learning school. Yeah. And so they were asking me all these questions about dental careers and about dental procedures and about dental visits. But everything they were asking me came from TikTok. But it was like health information. Yeah. They were asking me about vaping. They were asking me about veneers. They were asking me about the connections between systemic conditions and oral health. They had good information. It originated from TikTok, but then they're asking more questions. Yeah. And I think they're seeking information in a different way than before. And so, yeah, I think just trying to figure out where they're at, and then as clinicians at some point, they're going to start trying to figure out where patients are at, instead of that stereotypical, like the hygienist is the nagger and just yells at you all the time about what you haven't done. They're really trying to figure out like where people are coming from and what information they do have or don't have. And then I think what I'm working with this high school on is they're going to start making some videos for one of their classes about oral health. Because I'm like, if that's where you're getting your information, that's where other people are getting it too. So how can you put some information into that world that's accurate, that other people can access? So I think then it comes back to getting information to people in the way that they actually want it. Yeah. Because a brochure that's sitting on your desk collecting dust is not the way anymore.
Right.
You used to leave and you'd have 4 brochures and a toothbrush, and you're like, no one's going home and reading that.
Right.
They're just tossing that. So
even that's super fascinating. The transfer of information from like a clinician to a patient, right? You're doing you're showing them live, but you're hoping that they also take ownership of that information and implement it.
Yeah.
And it's like handing them a brochure afterwards.
No.
It's probably not going to be the way that they're
Right.
gonna. But like the idea of videos and social media, they consume it that like so much more that way. That's
but
how
if
they're gonna
you're
learn.
looking to do anything like fix your TV, you're going to YouTube,
Totally.
right?
Yeah.
Or maybe TikTok
Yeah.
in a shorter burst. But I mean, patients are doing the same thing with their health, and they're gonna go to where they know they can get the information the fastest, and easiest to digest. So, yeah, it's really interesting to watch that change.
Yeah.
But I think it's for the better.